There is a man in this story who built one of the largest companies in West Africa. He started with nothing. He came from a small village where the biggest dream most people had was a government job and a monthly salary. He had neither. He had a brain that never stopped working and hands that never stopped moving and a stubbornness that took him from that village to a corner office on the 35th floor of his own building in Lagos. He spent 50 years building something real. And then one morning he looked in the mirror and understood that he was getting old. And the company, his company, the thing he had poured everything into, needed someone to carry it when he could no longer carry it himself. He had no children. He had no obvious heir. He had 3 candidates, 3 finalists from a nationwide search, 3 business people who had been assessed and tested and interviewed at every level before reaching this final stage. And he didn't trust any of the tests, because every test he had designed so far could be prepared for. Every evaluation could be gamed by someone smart enough and ambitious enough. He could see through the answers. He could not see through the people. So on the night before the final interview, he did something nobody expected. He took off the suit. He put on a torn jacket and dirty shoes. He messed up his hair and rubbed dirt on his face. He took a bottle filled with cold tea that looked exactly like whiskey, and he sat down in the mud on the road leading to his mountain villa and he waited. He wanted to see something that no interview could show him. He wanted to see who his candidates were when they thought the moment didn't count. When they passed an old drunk man on the side of the road and thought nobody was watching. The first candidate drove past. The second candidate stopped, but what she did next will tell you everything you need to know about her. The third candidate was running late. And what this young man did when he saw an old man face down in the mud on the most important morning of his professional life, that is the part that changed everything. Stay right here. Like this video right now if you believe that who you are when nobody is watching is who you actually are. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub, hit that bell, new story every week, never miss one. Comment below, has someone ever tested you without you knowing? Tell us what happened. His full name was Richard Oluwafemi. He was born in 1948 in a small town called Ijebu-ode in Ogun State, Nigeria, a town that was, by any objective measure, not where empires began. It was a decent town, a market town, a place with a proud history and a functioning community and the specific rhythm of a small city that knew what it was and had made peace with it. It was not Lagos. It was not Ibadan. It was the kind of place where ambition was not frowned upon exactly, but was viewed with the specific mild skepticism of a community that had seen ambitious young men leave, and had also seen them come back with less than they left with. Richard's father was a school teacher. His name was Pa Ademi James, and he taught English at the local secondary school for 32 years, with the consistent devotion of someone who had decided what his contribution to the world was going to be, and who was going to make it regardless of what it paid him, which was not much. He was a thin, precise man who carried himself with the particular dignity of someone whose self-respect was not derived from external sources. He was kind in the specific way of people who have thought about what kindness actually requires rather than what it looks like. His mother was Mama Comfort Ademi, who had been Comfort Okafor before she married Pa James, and who had never fully abandoned the Okafor spirit, which was the spirit of someone who found ways to make things work when making things work seemed impossible. She ran a small provision store from the front of their house, and she maintained the family's financial reality with a precision and a patience that Richard would later identify as the most important business education he ever received. He was the second of 4 children, an older sister, 2 younger brothers. The household was not poor in the way of people who did not eat. It was poor in the way of people who counted carefully and planned ahead, and for whom an unexpected expense was a genuine crisis that required restructuring. The provision store gave them food, Pa James's salary gave them school fees. What it did not give them was margin. Richard understood margin from the time he was 8 years old. He understood it because of an incident that was small in itself, but that lodged in his memory with the precision of something significant. He had wanted to go to a traveling circus that had come to ijebu-ode, the kind of event that happened once or twice a year, that the whole town talked about for weeks before and weeks after. The tickets were not expensive. But that particular week, the provision store had had a slow period, and the family's available cash was entirely allocated to specific things, and there was no extra. Pa James told him there was no money for the circus. Richard did not argue. He did not cry. He went to his room and he sat on the floor and he thought for a genuine hour of careful thinking about how to get money. By the next morning, he had a plan. He went to 3 neighbors and offered to fetch water from the community tap, which was 4 streets away, in exchange for a small payment each. Water fetching was a daily necessity, and most households did it themselves, but it was time-consuming and physical, and enough neighbors were willing to pay someone else to do it that Richard's offer was accepted. He fetched water for a week. He earned the ticket money plus a small extra. He went to the circus. He also kept fetching water for 2 of the 3 neighbors who had asked him to continue. This was the beginning. He was a student who was good at school without being spectacular, the kind who worked hard and understood things properly rather than the kind who understood things effortlessly. His mathematics was strong. His English was good, which was not surprising given Pa James. He was a student who asked questions that showed he had thought about the previous answer, which made him memorable to his teachers and occasionally irritating to his classmates. He went to the University of Lagos in 1968. His scholarship covered a portion. The water-fetching money, which had evolved over the years into a small network of neighborhood errands and services, covered some. Pa James took a loan from his teacher's cooperative to cover the rest. Richard told his father he would pay it back. "I know," Pa James said, simply without performance. University was where the specific shape of Richard's intelligence became clear. He was studying business administration, but what he was actually studying was everything. He read economics and history and engineering, and the biographies of people who had built things and the post-mortems of companies that had failed. He had the quality of someone who understood that the boundaries between disciplines were administrative rather than intellectual, and that understanding business required understanding everything that business touched. He also had a specific insight that arrived in his second year. He was reading a case study about a Lagos trading company that had grown significantly in the 1950s and had then contracted in the 1960s. The contraction was attributed to competition and market change. But Richard, reading the case study carefully, saw something else. The company had not failed because of competition. It had failed because, as it grew, the decisions moved further and further from the people who understood the work, and the people making the decisions had stopped understanding what was actually happening. He wrote in the margin of the case study, "Growth without trust is just scale without direction." He kept thinking about this for 30 years. He graduated in 1972. The economy was in one of its complicated phases. Nigeria was managing the aftermath of the Civil War, and the adjustment of significant oil wealth arriving in a system not designed to handle it. There were opportunities and there were traps, and the two often looked very similar. Richard took a job at a Lagos trading company, not the same one from the case study, a different one in the import-export trade. He was an analyst. He analyzed markets, tracked commodity prices, helped the company understand when to buy and when to hold and when to move. He was good at it. He was also watching. From the inside of a functioning trading company, he was watching everything: the supply chains, the relationships with suppliers and buyers, the specific points where money was lost and where it was made. He was building a mental map of how the whole thing worked. He stayed for 3 years. He left in 1975 with a specific idea. The idea was about transport, more specifically, about the gap between what goods cost to move and what it was possible to make them cost to move with better organization. He had been watching goods sit in the port for days that should have been hours. He had been watching trucks take routes that made no sense. He had been watching coordination failures that cost everyone money at every step. He had no capital. He went to Pa James. His father listened to the full explanation. He asked 2 questions, both of which were the right questions, which Richard noted and stored. Then he went to his bedroom and came back with a tin. "Your mother's savings," Pa James said. "She says it is for your business. She says to tell you that she has been waiting for you to ask." Richard looked at the tin. "When did she start saving this?" he said. "When you were 9, Pa James said. "After the circus. She said you were not a child who asked. You were a child who solved. She said she wanted to be ready for when you came." Richard looked at his father. "I will pay it back," he said. "I know," Pa James said, again simply. He registered ijebu-ode Freight and Logistics in 1975. He started with 2 trucks bought secondhand, both in need of work, fixed by a mechanic he paid partly in cash and partly in future equity in the company's vehicle maintenance contract. He started with 5 clients, all from his network at the trading company, all of whom trusted his analysis enough to trust his logistics. The first year was the most difficult. Not because the business was failing, because the business was surviving by margins that required constant attention. He drove one of the trucks himself sometimes. He negotiated with port authority officials in the specific way of someone who understood that some conversations needed to happen at the right time of day, with the right information available. He built relationships that took years to produce returns, and that produced returns that no one-time transaction could have produced. By 1980, ijebu-ode Freight and Logistics had 15 trucks and 40 clients. By 1985, it had its own warehousing. By 1990, the holding company was formed, ijebu-ode Group, with the freight division and a new real estate arm and the beginning of a commodity trading operation that would become, in the following decade, one of the company's most significant revenue streams. Pa James died in 1988. Richard was at the funeral in ijebu-ode, in a suit that his father would have recognized as expensive without knowing how expensive. He stood at the graveside and he held Mama Comfort's hand and he thought about the tin. He thought about the margin. He thought about the 2 questions his father had asked when he explained the business, both right, both showing that Pa James understood the idea at the level that mattered. He thought, "I will spend the rest of my life trying to ask the 2 right questions." Mama Comfort lived until 2010. She moved to Lagos in 1995 when the house in ijebu-ode was no longer practical for her to manage alone, and she lived in a house that Richard bought for her in a quiet part of Ikeja that she chose herself because it reminded her, she said, of a particular street in ijebu-ode that she had always liked. She still ran a small provision store. From the front of the house, she refused to stop. "Mama," Richard said, the last time he visited before she got too ill to continue, "you don't need to work." "I know," she said, "it is not about the need." "What is it about?" he said. "The need to be useful," she said. "When I stop being useful, I stop." She stopped in 2010. Richard sat with this for a long time after her funeral. He was 62. He had no children. He had been married once briefly in his early 30s to a woman he had met through a business connection, and the marriage had been honest and genuine, and had ended without bitterness when they both understood that they wanted different things from life, and that neither of those different things was the marriage itself. He had not remarried. Not from loss or regret, from the specific self-awareness of someone who understood his own requirements for a relationship, and who had found that the company, as it grew, made those requirements increasingly difficult to meet. He had his company, and his company was going to need someone to run it after him. Stay with us, the search is about to begin. The announcement of the Great Talent Search. That was not what Ademi Group called it, but that was what the press called it, came in 2015. Richard was 67 years old. He was not ill. He was not incapacitated, but he had spent 50 years watching companies fail because their founders held on too long and because the transition happened under crisis rather than under planning. He was not going to make that mistake. He was going to choose his successor while he was still clear-headed enough to choose well and while the company was still strong enough to sustain the transition. The formal announcement said that the Ademi Group Board of Directors had initiated a succession planning process and that a CEO selection would be completed within the next 18 months. The selection would be conducted through a combination of internal evaluation, external candidate search, and a formal assessment process designed to identify both competence and character. Character, the announcement said specifically, was not a secondary criterion. It was the primary one. The press found this amusing. Character was not the kind of word that typically appeared in CEO selection announcements from West African conglomerates. The business press wrote several pieces about whether this meant something specific or was simply corporate language. Richard had meant something specific. He had also, in the weeks before the announcement, been doing something that had nothing to do with the official search. He had been falling in love. Her name was Dr. Adiz Nwachukwu. She was 58 years old. She was the founder and CEO of a healthcare management consulting firm that had, over 20 years, become the most respected operation of its kind in Nigeria. She had built it with the specific combination of clinical training. She was originally a physician, trained at University College Hospital Ibadan, and business acumen that she had developed through 15 years of watching the healthcare system fail at the intersection of medical competence and operational incompetence. She had done for healthcare management what Richard had done for freight logistics. She had mapped the gaps. She had built the organization to fill them. She had done it with 30 employees and a clarity of purpose that had never diluted regardless of how large the operation became. They had met at a conference, not a romantic meeting, a professional one. She was speaking on a panel about healthcare infrastructure and private sector partnership. He was in the audience because someone on his team had put the conference on his calendar, and he had decided at the last minute to attend. She said something on the panel that made him stop. She said, "The most expensive thing in any organization is the distance between the person making the decision and the person who understands the problem." He wrote it down. Afterward, he found her at the reception. "You said something on the panel," he said, "about the distance between the decision and the understanding." She looked at him. "I have been thinking about that for 30 years, he said. "I have never heard someone else say it." "I have been thinking about it for 20, she said. "Where did the thought come from?" he said. She told him. He told her where his version had come from. They talked for 2 hours. He called his assistant the next morning and asked for her contact information. He called her. She answered on the 3rd ring. They had a second conversation for 90 minutes. He asked if she would have lunch. She said, "You are starting a succession process. I am potentially a candidate." He looked at his phone. She was right. She was, by any objective assessment, one of the most qualified people in the country for the role. "Yes," he said. "That is a conflict," she said. "Yes," he said, "if you are a candidate." A pause. "Are you asking me to lunch as a professional courtesy or as something else?" she said. "Something else," he said. Another pause. "I am not going to be a candidate," she said. "I have my own company. I did not spend 20 years building it to hand it over." "That is a very reasonable position," he said. So the conflict does not exist, she said. No, he said. Thursday, she said. 12:30, I choose the restaurant. Of course, he said. She chose a restaurant in Victoria Island that was excellent and that he had not been to, which he considered intentional. They had lunch for 3 hours. She was the most direct person he had spent sustained time with in 30 years of professional life. Not rude, direct. She said what she thought without the specific management of information that most people applied to conversations with people of his professional standing. She disagreed with 2 things he said during the lunch and said so clearly and gave her reasons. He found this the most interesting experience he had had at a meal in many years. They saw each other regularly after Thursday. Not publicly, not as an announcement or a declaration, but consistently. She came to his house for dinner. He came to her apartment. They had long phone conversations on Sunday evenings that covered everything except, usually, the succession process, which both of them understood was the topic they were carefully not letting contaminate what was developing between them. He told her about the Drunkard plan before he told anyone else. They were in her apartment on a Wednesday evening. She was reading something from her work and he was thinking out loud, which she had come to recognize as one of his specific habits, thinking with sound rather than silence. He said, "The final interview is next Saturday. 3 candidates at the villa. I need to see something the formal process cannot show me." She looked up from her reading. "What do you need to see?" she said. He told her. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You are going to lie in a ditch," she said. "On a road," he said. "And pretend to be drunk," she said. "Pretend to be distressed," he said. "On the most important morning of their professional lives," she said. "Yes," he said. "What if all 3 of them stop?" she said. "That would also be useful information," he said. "I would need to evaluate what they did when they stopped." She looked at him. "And what if none of them stop?" she said. He was quiet. "Then I learned something I needed to know before I make this decision," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I think it is the right test," she said. "I also think it is going to be cold and uncomfortable, and that you are going to get genuinely muddy." "Yes," he said. "Do you want me to be there?" she said. "Not at the villa near the road, in case something goes wrong." He looked at her. "In case something goes wrong," he said. "You are 77 years old," she said. "You are about to lie on a muddy road and pretend to be incapacitated. I would like someone sensible to be nearby." He looked at her for a moment. "You think I am being ridiculous," he said. "I think you are being exactly who you have always been," she said. "I would like to be nearby anyway." He said, "Park on the hill road above the turn. You'll be able to see." She said, "I will bring a flask of tea." "Bring 2, he said. She looked at him. "Who is the second one for?" she said. "For whichever candidate stops," he said. "They may need something warm afterward." She looked at him. She had the specific expression of someone who has arrived at a point past which surprise is no longer possible. "Go to sleep," she said. "You have a muddy road to get to early." He went to sleep. The morning of the test is coming, and the road is waiting. The 3 candidates had each received the same invitation. A letter formal, on the company's letterhead, personally signed by Richard Adami, informing them that they had been selected as finalists in the Adami Group CEO succession process. The final interview would be held at the Adami Mountain Villa, 3 hours from Lagos on the Ibadan Road. They were to arrive at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. The interview would be conducted personally by Mr. Adami. All 3 had accepted. All 3 had spent the preceding weeks in the specific state of preparation that people enter when something very large is approaching. They had researched the company. They had prepared their vision statements and their strategic perspectives, and their answers to the kinds of questions that final-round CEO interviews typically asked. None of them had prepared for a muddy road. The first candidate was Mark Adekunle. He was 44 years old. He ran the Nigerian operations of an international financial services company, a role that had produced over 8 years results that were measurable and significant. He was the kind of person who had built his career on the specific currency of performance metrics. His presentations were precise. His projections were detailed. His track record was the kind that looked very good on the printed page, and that had impressed every committee that had evaluated his candidacy up to this point. He had also grown up with money in a way that Richard had not. His father was a banker, a senior one, the kind whose name opened doors, and Mark had grown up in a Lagos household where the specific experience of comfort was the baseline rather than the goal. This was not his fault. It had simply shaped certain things about how he experienced the world, specifically, the ways in which he divided it. He drove to the mountain villa in a red Porsche. He drove it the way people drive cars they are proud of, well, but with the consciousness of the car that comes from ownership of something you consider significant. He came around the bend in the mountain road at 8:20, which was 40 minutes before the interview. He saw Richard. Richard had positioned himself carefully. He was not in the middle of the road, which would have created a traffic situation. He was at the side on the shoulder but visible. He was face down on the muddy shoulder, the bottle near his hand, in the specific posture of a man who had fallen and could not get up. He had been in position since 7:15 and he was cold and the mud was real and the discomfort was considerable. He heard the Porsche slow. He did not look up. He stayed in character. He made a sound, not a dramatic sound, just the sound of someone who was distressed and not fully conscious. The Porsche did not stop. It slowed. Richard heard the engine change, and then it accelerated past. Mark had seen him. Richard was certain of this. The slow had been the recognition, and the acceleration had been the decision. He heard the car go around the next bend. He stayed still for a moment. He thought about the case study in university, about the company that had failed because the decisions moved away from the people who understood the work. He thought, a CEO who cannot stop for a man in a ditch, cannot stop for anything he has decided, is below the level of his attention. He stayed in position. The second candidate was Linda Okonkwo. She was 38 years old. She was the youngest of the three, and in some ways the most impressive on paper. She had built and sold 2 companies before 35, both of which had produced returns that the press had covered with the specific enthusiasm of a story that confirmed a narrative about a new generation of business leadership. She was sharp in a way that was immediately obvious, the kind of sharp that you registered before she spoke because it was in how she moved and where she looked. She drove a white Mercedes. She came around the bend at 8:40. She saw Richard. She stopped. Richard heard the Mercedes engine cut. He heard the door open. He thought for a moment, genuinely, that she was going to come to him. The door did not close, but she did not approach. "Hello," she said from the car. Richard made the sound again, distressed, confused. He heard her feet on the gravel. Not coming toward him, she had stepped partially out of the car but had not walked to him. "Are you all right?" she called. "Please," Richard said, in Pa Ben's voice, the character he had decided on, slightly rough, slightly confused. "I cannot get up. I have fallen." A pause. She came a few steps closer. She looked at him. He kept his head turned away. She would not see his face. He heard something, her hand going into her bag. She crouched, not all the way down, not to his level, but in the specific crouch of someone who does not want to get their clothes on the ground. She placed something on the ground near his hand. He looked very carefully with his peripheral vision. A note, a folded bill. "There is a village 3 kilometers down the road," she said. "There will be people there who can help you. She stood. She walked back to the car. The door closed. The Mercedes drove away. Richard stayed still. He thought about the bill on the ground. He thought about the specific arithmetic of it. She had stopped, which was more than Mark had done. She had spoken to him, come closer, confirmed he was alive. She had given money, which was the resource she had identified as the appropriate response. What she had not done was touch him. She had not brought him to his feet. She had not determined whether he needed more than a note on the ground. She had not waited to confirm that the village 3 kilometers away was reachable by a man who could not get up. She had solved the problem that was convenient to solve and moved to the next item on the schedule. He lay in the mud for another 20 minutes. The third candidate arrived at 9:05. His name was David S. He was 31 years old. He was the youngest and the least obvious candidate. He had not sold companies. He had not run international operations. He had built, from the age of 24, a community development foundation that had grown into one of the most respected social enterprise operations in the southwest of Nigeria, running vocational training centers, microfinance schemes for small traders, and a supply chain support program for small agricultural producers. The foundation was not a charity in the way of organizations that distributed resources without building capacity. It was a business that operated on the premise that sustainable development required economic structures rather than transfers. It ran on income from the businesses it had incubated and from the proceeds of the supply chain program it had built. He had been the most surprising finalist to the evaluation committee. He was not a traditional CEO candidate. He did not have the financial services background or the corporate track record of the other two. Richard had insisted he be included. He had read a profile of David's work in a business magazine 2 years earlier. He had torn out the page and put it in a folder and had thought about it intermittently since. When the evaluation committee presented its long list, David's name was not on it. Richard had put it on the list himself, without explanation, and the committee had accepted this. David drove a Toyota Camry. Not new, a few years old, clean and maintained with the care of someone who takes care of what they have rather than replacing it when it could be renewed. He came around the bend at 9:05. He was 5 minutes late. He saw Richard immediately. The brakes came on hard enough that the tires said something on the gravel. The car stopped. The door opened. He was running before Richard had processed the sound of the door. "Sir," he said. He was already crouching beside Richard, hand on his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" "I hear you," Richard said, staying in character. "Can you tell me where it hurts?" David said. His hands were moving professionally, checking for obvious injury, the specific focused assessment of someone who had done first aid training and was applying it in real time. "My back," Richard said. "I fell, I cannot get up." "Don't try to get up yet," David said. "Let me check first." He checked, carefully. He ran his hand along Richard's back with the attention of someone who understood that moving an injured person incorrectly could cause damage. "I don't think anything is broken," David said, "but we need to get you up slowly. Can you tell me how long you have been here?" "A long time," Richard said. "Have any other cars passed?" David said. Richard said nothing. David understood. "Okay," David said. "I'm going to help you sit up first. Lean on me." He helped Richard up. He was strong, the physical strength of someone who worked regularly with his hands, who spent time on the ground in communities being built rather than in offices discussing them. He got Richard to his feet. He walked him to the car. He opened the passenger door and settled him in. He looked at his watch. He was 9 minutes late for the most important interview of his life, and he was just beginning to understand that. "I need to take you somewhere," David said. "There is a village." "I know the village," Richard said. He was watching David's face. "I will take you there," David said. "Then I have to go to a meeting. I am already late." "Your meeting is important," Richard said. David looked at him. "Very important," he said. "But you are here and you cannot drive, and I am not leaving you on the road." He got in the car. He drove toward the village. He said as he drove, "What is your name?" "Richard," the old man said. David looked at him briefly. "David," he said, "are you cold?" "A little," Richard said. David reached into the back seat without looking and found a jacket. He put it on the old man's lap. "That is your jacket," Richard said. "I have another meeting after this one," David said. "I will survive without the jacket." They drove in silence for a few minutes. "Your family knows you are on this road," David said. "I have no family," Richard said. David was quiet. "Are you from this area?" David said. "No," Richard said. "What were you doing on the road?" David said. Richard thought for a moment. "I got confused," he said. "I thought I was going somewhere and I found myself somewhere else." David glanced at him. "That happens," David said, "to a lot of people, not just on roads." They reached the village. David took Richard to the small health post. He spoke to the attendant. He ensured Richard was being seen. He bought water and biscuits from the provision shop across from the health post and put them where Richard could reach them. He looked at his watch. He was 22 minutes late. He looked at Richard. "You are going to be all right," he said. "Yes," Richard said, "thank you." "Is there someone I can call for you?" David said. "No," Richard said, "I will be fine." David looked at him for a moment. "You are sure?" he said. "I am very sure," Richard said. David nodded. He drove away fast. Richard sat in the health post chair. He said to the attendant, "Could I use your phone to make a call?" He called Adiz. "He is on his way," he said. 22 minutes late. He is going to be mortified when he arrives." "Did he stop?" she said. "He stopped," he said. "He ran from the car." A pause. "He ran," she said. "Yes," he said. "Get in the car," she said. "I am coming to collect you. You are covered in mud and you cannot arrive at your own villa in that state." He looked at his clothes. "Yes," he said. She arrived in 8 minutes. She had a towel and a change of clothes in the car. She had also, he noticed, the flask of tea. She looked at him as he got in. She looked at the mud on his face and his hands. She looked at the jacket that was no longer on his back. "He gave you his jacket," she said. "Yes," he said. She handed him the tea. "Drink," she said. He drank. She drove. "Tell me everything," she said. "The villa is waiting, and so are 2 very confident finalists. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub. The boardroom scene is coming. Hit that bell." The Adami Mountain Villa was the kind of place that made a statement before you opened the door. It sat on a rise above the valley, accessible by the road that Richard had been lying on, which meant that every candidate had passed his position on the way in. The building itself was not ostentatious in the way of things that try to impress with size. It was large and well-built and specifically chosen by Richard 20 years earlier, because the view from the main room was, in his opinion, the most clarifying view he had ever seen, mountains and forest and distance that put the specific urgency of daily business into a perspective that he found useful. He used the villa for decisions. When something was complicated enough that the Lagos office was too close to it, he came here and sat with the view and thought until the complication simplified. The interview room was the main room. Large windows, long table, 8 chairs, the company's history on one wall, not trophies or awards, photographs, the actual history, Pa Adami at the first truck, the first warehouse, the expansion across borders, the portraits of people who had built the company alongside Richard, many of whose names the business press had never published because they had built things in the operational reality rather than the visibility layer. Mark was there when David's assistant had called ahead to say he was late. Mark had arrived at 8:53 and had been in the room since then. He was in full professional presentation mode, suit perfectly pressed, materials organized, the specific charged readiness of someone who has been preparing for this and is ready to demonstrate it. Linda had arrived at 9:01. She had come in with the efficiency of someone who had assessed the room in 10 seconds and had positioned herself strategically. She had noted David's absence. She had noted it again at 9:15. By 9:20, she was making the specific kind of remarks that establish a narrative. 20 minutes late, she said to the room in general, for a final CEO interview. Unusual, Mark said. Unprofessional, Linda said, whatever the reason. Very difficult to come back from, Mark said. They settled into the comfortable discussion of someone else's failing. David arrived at 9:27. He came in through the door with the specific energy of someone who has been moving fast and has not yet slowed down. His suit had a mark on the knee where he had crouched. His hair was slightly disturbed. He did not have his jacket. "I apologize," he said to the room. "I was unavoidably delayed on the road." Mark and Linda looked at him with the expressions they had prepared. "Unavoidably delayed," Linda said, "on the day of a final CEO interview." "Yes," David said. He sat down. He was breathing slightly quickly. He had clearly walked fast from the car. "There was a man on the road. He had fallen and could not get up. I took him to the village health post." A silence. Mark looked at Linda. Linda looked at David. "You stopped," Mark said, "for a drunk on the road." "He was not drunk," David said. "He had fallen. He was an old man alone on a mountain road and he could not get up." "And you chose that," Linda said, "over this." "I chose it," David said. "Yes." "That is," Mark said carefully, "an interesting set of priorities." "It is," David said. He was not defensive. He said it the way he would have said any fact. "I would make the same choice again." The room was quiet. Then the door at the far end of the room opened. A man came in. He was wearing a gold suit, not literally gold, but the specific shade of a very expensive fabric in a color that was close to it. He was clean and sharp, and he moved with the ease of someone who had walked into many rooms and who had never found a room that made him uncertain. Mark looked at him. Linda looked at him. David looked at him. And then David's face did something specific. He looked at the man's face. He looked at his hands. He looked at the shape of him, the height, the breadth of the shoulders, the specific way he held himself. He thought, "I know this person." He thought, "I have seen this person in the last hour." He thought, "The mud is gone and the jacket is gone, and the clothes are completely different, but the face." The face was the same. Ijebu-ode sat at the head of the table. He looked at each of the three people across from him. He looked at Mark first. "Good morning, Mark," he said. "You drove past me on the road at approximately 8:20. Mark went very still. "You drove past," Richard said. "You slowed, I heard the engine, and then you accelerated past. The old man in the mud face down was something that did not require your stopping." Mark said nothing. "You are very good at what you do," Richard said. "I have reviewed everything you have produced over 8 years of running our Nigerian competitors' operations. The numbers are excellent. The structure is sound. You understand financial services at a level that very few people in this country do." He paused. "You do not understand people the same way." He looked at Linda. "You stopped," he said. "That is different from Mark." Linda said nothing. "You came closer," he said. "You confirmed I was alive. You placed a note on the ground near my hand." "I thought you needed resources," Linda said. Her voice was controlled. "Yes," Richard said. You thought about the resource. You did not think about the person. You determined the most efficient response to the situation, money that someone else would turn into help, and you provided it and you left. He looked at her. You are one of the sharpest business minds in this country. I do not say that as a formality. The two companies you built and sold before 35 show a quality of vision and execution that is genuinely rare. He paused. But a company is 3,000 people, he said. When those 3,000 people encounter difficulty, they need a leader who sees them as people first and as resources second. Your response on that road was the response of someone who saw a resource problem and optimized for it. He looked at David. You were the last to arrive, he said. I know, David said. By 27 minutes, Richard said. I know, David said. Mark and Linda used those 27 minutes to establish a narrative about your lateness, Richard said. I would like you to know that. I expected they might, David said. It does not trouble you, Richard said. David thought about it. It troubles me that my lateness inconvenienced you and the other candidates, he said. It does not trouble me that I was late for the reason I was late. Tell me about the man on the road, Richard said. David told him, precisely in the specific order that things happened. The car, the brakes, running, the assessment, helping him up, the drive to the village, the health post, the water and biscuits, the phone call offer. Richard listened without expression. When David finished, Richard said, the man did not have a family. He said he didn't, David said. Did you believe him? Richard said. David thought. I don't know, he said. It seemed true, but even if it wasn't information I needed to have in order to make the decision I made. Richard looked at him. What decision was that? He said. That he needed help, David said, and that I was there and I could provide it. Those were the only facts that mattered. A very long silence. You do not know who I am, Richard said, not a question. David looked at him. He looked at the face again. He looked at the hands. You were on the road, David said. Richard was quiet. You are the man I took to the village this morning, David said. Another silence. Yes, Richard said. Mark inhaled sharply. Linda closed her eyes briefly. David looked at Richard for a long moment. The jacket, David said. Adiz has it, Richard said. Who is Adiz? David said. The woman I intend to marry, Richard said. She was parked on the hill road above the turn with a flask of tea. She was there in case something went wrong. David was quiet. The test was real, Richard said. Not a metaphor, not a simulation. I was on that road because I needed to see something that this room cannot show me. He looked at all three of them. I have been doing this for 50 years, he said. 50 years of watching what happens to companies when they grow beyond the ability of the people running them to see the whole thing, when the decisions move too far from the understanding, when the person at the top loses the specific connection to what the company actually is, not what it looks like on a report, but what it is. He looked at Mark. What it is, he said, is 3,000 people, every one of whom is going to have a morning that looks like my morning this morning, every one of whom is going to be on the road and needs someone to stop. He looked at Linda. And the leader who stops, he said, is not stopping because of a calculation. The calculation comes later. The stopping is the thing that happens before the calculation, in the 2 seconds when the car slows and the decision is made. He looked at David. You slammed your brakes, he said. Yes, David said. Before you thought about being late, he said. Yes, David said. Tell me why, Richard said. David thought about it honestly. Because he was there, David said. Because he was a person who needed something. Those two facts happened in my head before anything else did. Richard sat with this for a moment. Then he said, What is the most important thing you would do differently at ijebu-ode group from what has been done before? It was the first formal interview question. And David answered it. He answered it with the specific understanding of someone who had been building a different kind of organization for 7 years. An organization built around what people needed rather than what metrics required. He talked about the supply chain program and what it had taught him about the relationship between a large organization and the smaller ones in its orbit. He talked about the vocational training centers and what they had revealed about the gap between what people were capable of and what circumstances gave them access to. He talked about the specific structures that could make a company of 3,000 people feel like a community rather than a machine. Mark and Linda were quiet while he talked. Richard listened. When David finished, Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you, all 3 of you. The formal decision will be communicated through the board process in the next 2 weeks. I expect that timeline to be honored and that this conversation will remain in this room until the formal announcement." He stood. He looked at Mark. "I respect what you have built," he said. "Your career is real and your skills are real. The company that finds the right role for you will benefit significantly." He looked at Linda. "I respect what you have built more," he said. "You have built things from nothing and you have done it twice. The thing that limited you today is learnable. Whether you choose to learn it is your decision." He looked at David. He said nothing for a moment. "Your jacket is in the car," he said. "Adiz will return it before you leave." He left the room. The story is almost done, but the last part is the most important. The formal announcement came 11 days later. David was appointed Group Chief Executive Officer of ijebu-ode Group, effective the 1st of the following month, subject to a 6-month transition period during which Richard would remain as Executive Chairman. The business press was surprised. David was the youngest of the finalists and the least conventionally corporate. Several analysts wrote pieces suggesting the selection was unusual and that the board had been influenced by Richard's personal preferences rather than objective assessment. Richard read the pieces. He did not respond to them publicly. He did respond privately in a handwritten letter to the board's lead independent director, which the director later described as the most direct communication he had received from a CEO in 30 years on various boards. The letter said, in summary, the decision was made on the basis of the criterion stated in the original announcement. Character was the primary criterion. The assessment of character was conducted through a method that the process did not publicize because the method required that the candidates not be aware of it. The method and its results are available for full board review. The selection stands. The board reviewed the method. They understood it. The selection stood. David came to the company with the specific quality of someone who had spent 7 years building something at a fundamentally human level, and who was now applying that quality to a significantly larger canvas. The transition period, 6 months of Richard beside him, available every day, was the most intensive education either of them had experienced. Richard did not tell David what to do. He asked him questions. The same 2 questions in different forms in every conversation. What is the gap? What does it cost? David came to understand these questions as the organizing framework of everything Richard had ever built. Every business insight Richard had ever had began with identifying a gap. The gap between how things were and how they should be, and then calculating the cost of that gap in all its forms: financial, human, systemic. He also came to understand something that Richard told him directly in the 3rd month of the transition. They were in the main room of the mountain villa, not for a decision, simply for a working day that Richard had suggested away from the Lagos office. The view was the view. Adiz was in the garden reading, which was her practice on visits here. Richard said, The thing I am going to leave you is not the company. David looked at him. The company will be what it will be, Richard said. I have made it as strong as I can make it, and you will make it different things than I made it, and some of those things will be better and some will be worse. And that is what succession means. It means the next person takes it forward in a way that is theirs, not mine. Then what are you leaving me? David said. The question, Richard said, the two questions. David waited. What is the gap? Richard said. And what does it cost in every form, not just the financial form? He looked at the view. My father asked me two right questions when I showed him the business plan, he said. He had been a school teacher for 32 years. He had never run a business, but he asked the two right questions. And they were right because he understood that every decision has a cost beyond the financial one, and that the cost that is not counted is the cost that eventually becomes the crisis. He looked at David. You ran to me on that road, he said, not because you calculated a return, because you understood that the cost of leaving someone in the mud was not the kind of cost you could afford, without a calculation. David was quiet. That instinct, Richard said, is the thing I am leaving you, not the company. The company is the result. The instinct is the source. Don't lose it to the company. David said, how do I make sure I don't? Richard thought. Do what I did, he said. Find a road. Once in a while, get close enough to the thing you are running that it can surprise you. The day it stops surprising you is the day you have moved too far. David nodded. And the woman in the garden, he said. Richard looked toward the window. What about her? He said. She was there, David said. On the hill above the road, you told me. Yes, Richard said. Why? David said. Richard was quiet for a moment. Because she wanted to be certain something sensible was nearby, he said. She watches out for you, David said. Yes, Richard said. That is what she does, David said. Richard looked at him. What are you asking? Richard said. Nothing, David said. I am making an observation. About, Richard said. About the kind of person who makes a leader possible, David said. Not the person who runs things. The person who makes it possible for the person who runs things to do it without losing themselves in it. Richard was quiet. She does that, he said. Yes, David said. I can see that. Richard looked at the garden. Adiz was reading. She had looked up once in the past hour when the conversation had gone quiet for a moment, and had met his eyes through the glass and had returned to her book. I am going to marry her, he said. I know, David said. How do you know? Richard said. Because she brought your jacket back personally when you left the villa, David said. And she did not give it to the assistant. She came to my car and she gave it to me and she said, this belongs to you. And then she said, take care of him. Richard looked at him. She said that, he said. Yes, David said. Take care of him, like it was something she had a right to ask. Richard was quiet. She does have a right to ask, he said. I know, David said. He looked at Richard. She also said something else, David said. What? Richard said. She said, he has been looking for you for 50 years. He just didn't know what you looked like until the road. Richard sat with this. He looked at the garden. The road, he said. Yes, David said. Richard stood. He walked to the garden door. He opened it. Adiz looked up from her book. She looked at him standing in the doorway. Tea, she said. Yes, he said. There is a flask in the bag, she said. I made enough for two. He came out and sat in the chair beside hers. She poured tea. She handed him the cup. She went back to her book. He sat with his tea and the mountain view and the specific quality of a garden in the afternoon, the light and the temperature and the sound of it. And he thought about Pa James asking the two right questions. He thought about Mama Comfort's tin of money that had been saving since he was 9. He thought about the circus and the water fetching and the first 2 trucks and the margin and 50 years of finding the gap and calculating the cost. He thought about the road. He thought about running footsteps on gravel. He thought, I asked what I needed to ask. I found what I needed to find. He put his hand on Adee's hand. She did not look up from her book, but her hand turned over and held his. They sat in the garden until the light changed. 3 years later, Ademi Group's annual report, the first one formally presented by CEO David Ez, included a section that was unusual for corporate annual reports. It was called the Foundation. It described the history of the company from the beginning, Pa Ademi's 2 questions, Mama Comfort's tin, the 2 trucks, the margin. It described the founding philosophy in the words that Richard had written in the margin of a case study in 1969. Growth without trust is just scale without direction. It included one photograph that was not of a building or a metric. It was a photograph of a road, a mountain road, the shoulder of it muddy, empty, with the specific quality of a place where something had happened. Under the photograph, one sentence: the moment that matters is the one you do not know is being watched. The business press wrote several pieces about the report. Most of them missed the point. One of them, a young writer for a Lagos business magazine, someone who had done enough research to understand what the road was, got it right. She wrote, "The succession of Ademi Group is not the story of a billionaire finding a CEO. It is the story of a man who spent 50 years looking for someone who had learned the same things he learned, from a different direction, and who found him on a mountain road on a cold morning when both of them thought the moment did not count." Richard read the piece in the villa. Adeez read it over his shoulder. "She understood," Adeez said. "Yes," Richard said. "You should write her a letter," Adeez said. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "Don't thank her," Adeez said. "Tell her the part she got wrong." He looked at her. "What part did she get wrong?" he said. "The moment that matters," Adeez said, "was not on the road. The moment that matters was in university in 1969, when a young man wrote something in the margin of a case study and kept asking the question for 50 years. She looked at the piece. The road was just where the answer showed up. He looked at her. "You are right," he said. "I know," she said. He wrote the letter. He told the writer what Adeez had said. The writer wrote back within the week. She said, "I will put this in the next piece." She did. The correction was better than the original. Richard Ademi spent 50 years building a company. He started with a tin of money his mother had been saving since he was 9 years old. He built with 2 trucks and 5 clients, and the specific discipline of someone who had grown up in a house where every kobo was a decision. He built with the 2 questions his father asked, and the margin his mother understood, and the insight of a 20-year-old who wrote something true in the margin of a case study and spent his whole life proving it. He ended with 3,000 people in 7 countries and an office on the 35th floor of his own building, and a view from a mountain villa that he used for the decisions that required perspective. And the most important decision he ever made, he made on a muddy shoulder of a mountain road at 7:15 in the morning in a torn jacket and borrowed dirt. He needed to find the person who ran to the car door before they calculated whether it was worth running. He found him. But here is what I want you to understand before we finish. The test was not about kindness. It was not about whether you were a nice person or a generous person or a charitable person. Those are real qualities and they matter, but they are not what Richard was testing for. He was testing for instinct. The instinct that happens before the calculation. The 2 seconds in which the car slows and the decision is made, and the decision is made from something that comes before strategy, before optics, before the question of what this looks like. Mark's instinct was, I am going to an interview. Linda's instinct was, what is the most efficient response to this problem? David's instinct was, that person needs help. Those three instincts, expressed in 2 seconds on a mountain road, told Richard everything he needed to know about who would be inside his company when the decisions mattered, and the cameras were off, and the only witness was the person who needed something. 3,000 people. Every one of them is going to have a morning on the road. Every one of them needs a leader whose instinct, before the calculation, before the optics, is to stop. If you are building something, if you are leading something, if you are responsible for other people in any form, personal or professional, ask yourself the Richard question. What is the gap? What does it cost? In every form, not just the financial one. And then ask the David question. When did I last stop before I calculated? That moment, the moment you stop before you calculate, is the moment that defines everything. Stay honest about it. Stay close enough to the road that it can still surprise you. This has been Tribal Tales Hub. If this story stayed with you, if the road and the jacket and the 2 questions landed like this video, 1 click, that is how you tell us to keep bringing stories like this one. Subscribe to Tribal Tales Hub. Every single week a new story, stories that stay with you. Hit that bell, be there every time. Comment below, tell us, have you ever made the David decision? The one that cost you something in the moment and was right anyway. Tell us. We read every single one. Share this video. Send it to a leader you know. Send it to someone who is building something. Send it to anyone who needs the reminder that the moment that matters is the one nobody is watching. This has been Tribal Tales Hub. We will see you in the next story.